Brian and Kenzie in the morning. And Chicago's alternative all day.
Q101.
Kenzie's Krimes.
Milwaukee police found body parts in a North Side apartment.
Not because I was angry with them, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me.
Believe me, if I started murdering people, there'd be none of you left.
This is evil, what those people have done to me.
C says Heaven's Gate awaiting.
I'm not guilty.
Q101.
Brian and Kenzie on Q101 with another edition of Kenzie's Krimes, a deep dive into a local murder mystery drama that Kenzie brings to us, and myself and Case don't know what she's going to talk about, just like you. So we're sitting around the campfire and listening to the story.
Karen Ann Phillips lived in North Carolina until she hit her early 20s, and she was looking for adventure. So in 1977, she decided to move to the beautiful city of Chicago. She was so excited for her big new adventure. She enrolled in Aurora College and graduated with a degree in biology. Her overall career goal was to become a nurse. So her studies continued at Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center, and she then moved to Oak Park in April of 1979. So one of her new passions at that time when she moved to Oak Park was attending the Temple of Kriya Yoga. She met a lot of her friends there, and that really became her core group. She actually got so into Kriya Yoga and, that temple that she was looking into priesthood within the temple. She was spending more and more money and actually started to go into crippling debt. Things that were happening at Temple and Kriya Yoga were obviously yoga, meditation, as well as group hypnosis. During the summer of 1980, when Karen was in the middle of a group hypnosis session, she had a disturbing vision that someday, and perhaps very soon, her life would end violently.
Whoa.
She did have a few friends, from beforehand. One of them was a guy named Jerry. He was from North Carolina. And she always referred to him as her out-of-town fiance. They were just so close, her closest guy friend. So he visited her in Chicago, and he decided to sit in on one of these temple sessions since she was so into it. He claimed that what he saw was incredibly disturbing. He shared this with his friend Karen. He really thought she should leave the temple and all the friends that she had made there. Karen was not having this. She really, really enjoyed being part of it. But Jerry was concerned. The temple was very free-spirited towards drugs, sex, kind of like whatever you wanted to do.
Love it.
It's funny, I was thinking, these are not my people.
But he thought that it had some seedy people almost taking advantage of those viewpoints, if that makes sense, right? He said that Karen was really naive. She was still in her young 20s, and she seemingly was becoming more and more naive. An example of this would be one day a strange man walked up to Karen on the street and offered to paint a portrait of her. So she led him to her home, let him inside, and let him paint her sitting in her apartment, and then he left. She was just making weird decisions. So Jerry was super disapproving, and this led to a rift between them. So Karen and him were not talking as much anymore, but she was actually able to fill her best friend man void pretty quickly because a guy named Peter moved into the apartment right above her in her building, and they became close friends really fast. One night, Peter went down to her apartment to return an iron he had borrowed. It's such a guy thing. Guys always need to borrow normal household items. But when she answered the door, she was on the phone, so he kind of didn't say anything. He just handed it to her, waved. But he did hear her say, "Don't call me tomorrow night. I'm going to be at Temple." And she seemed a little frustrated during the conversation. The next day, Karen had classes from 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. And the professor claimed that Karen seemed visibly upset the whole day she was at school. She seemed very frustrated. That night was her astrology class at the temple, and she hung out, and I'm quoting this, uncharacteristically late, to a point where actually one of the employees at the temple was like, "Do you want me to drive you to your car?" But Karen didn't feel like waiting for her, so she ended up walking really late night on her own to her car. When Karen got home that evening to her apartment building, she could hear her phone ringing. So she was walking inside the building, and she was so close to the front door, she could hear her phone ringing, right? Old school landline. So she ran into her apartment, but she never locked the front of the apartment building. On the phone was one of her friends, Helen from Temple. They made plans for the next day, and basically Karen then ended her evening. However, Karen's next door neighbor, who's literally right next to her, Muhammad, heard around 1 a.m. what seemed like a huge argument. and it went on for an extensive amount of time. It sounded like a couple's fight, right? Just back, forth, loud. Things were definitely getting hit, pounding noises, and he wanted to complain because he was like, you're keeping me up. It was 1 a.m, but he's like, I don't want to be that neighbor. Like, she's having a fight with somebody. I'm going to leave her alone. And he decided to go to bed. The next morning, Karen never showed up to meet her friend Helen like she was supposed to. And I'm going to pause right there.
Well, when we come back, the conclusion and what happened in 3 minutes with Brian and Kenzie on Q101 in today's edition of Kenzie Crime.
Brian and Kenzie in the morning. And Chicago's alternative all day.
Q101.
Brian and Kenzie on Q101 with the conclusion of Kenzie's crimes. And Kenzie left us with a cliffhanger as usual.
Karen Phillips had recently gotten super into cryo yoga, the actual temple, kind of in the Oak Park area. She'd spent a lot of her time in that, which included meditation, yoga, but also group hypnosis. She made plans to meet her friend Helen the next morning. Her neighbor Muhammad heard a huge, very long argument in Karen's apartment. And the next morning, Karen never met up with her friend Helen. Helen was initially really mad at her friend because she thought she blew her off. But then as more time passed and she never got a phone call, she asked for her husband Dominic to drive to Karen's apartment because Helen wanted to wait near the phone. Again, this is the 1970s before cell phones. So Dominic gets there. Karen's car was outside the apartment. So he's like, okay. And he went and was knocking on the door. No one was answering. Then he decided to knock on the neighbor's door, Muhammad, who had heard the fight. And he's like, actually, I heard a huge argument last night. Peter, then from upstairs, other friend came downstairs, like, what's going on? They're like, we can't find Karen. There was a huge fight last night. So they actually climb on top of each other to look through the window above Karen's door. The only thing they could see was that the burners to her stove were on. And they go, you know what? We are calling the police. So the police officers show up. They were not able to get in through her door, so they actually had to break in through one of her windows. It didn't take long, a few steps into Karen's apartment, and they saw her body face down in a pool of blood.
Ugh.
She had been severely beaten to death. Both of her hands were laying on the floor with the pointer finger and thumb touching, and then the other 3 fingers spanned out, kind of if you were going to put it over your eye or say like okie dokie, kind of that. In the Krimes religion, which is the temple she was part of, this means the peaceful acceptance of death. So there was evidence of a struggle. Things were knocked over in the apartment. However, the door chain was locked. So the killer either was welcomingly let into her building or broken somewhere else. Outside the building in the bushes, police found a tire iron with dried blood and hair on it.
Ew,
so they
yuck.
found the murder weapon. A man named Stephen Linscott called the police station and said he had read about the murder in the paper. And he was basically saying to the cops, hey, you're gonna think this is stupid, but I had a dream the same night Karen was murdered. I saw a man beating a woman to death. He was able to describe this man from his dream. He was blonde, with short, straight hair, square build, and in the dream he was wearing a terry cloth striped shirt. He said the guy in his dream was actually easygoing and felt comfortable around this woman as if he knew her. And he said the victim was struck while laying down or crouching, and said the victim wasn't fighting back. There was no resistance, as if she accepted or had peace about her death. So this was really freaked the cops out because obviously not all those details were released. So this man, again, Stephen, he was 26 years old. He was a Bible student. He was married with kids, and he lived at a halfway house counseling ex-convict. He also was the building right next door to Karen's. Officers were like, can you write all this down? This is a lot. So officers arrived at Stephen's home. They claimed that they asked him, do you know what the murder weapon was? And they said that Stephen said it was a skinny, blunt object, and he thought it was a tire iron. The officers also described the fact that basically what Stephen had described that the killer looked like Stephen. So you're describing yourself. This is your short, blonde hair, square build. So they were like, it looks like you. You have all this information. So they asked Stephen to please come in for questioning, but said, hey, you're not a suspect. Stephen shows up wearing a terry cloth shirt with stripes on it for questioning. The shirt that he described in the dream.
Okay.
Was he carrying a bloody tire iron too?
He was not.
Okay.
They continued to deny that he was a suspect. they brought in a sketch artist and were like, vividly describe everything. When the sketch artist was done, the sketch looked like Steven.
Shocker.
Now, Steven willingly gave DNA samples. He had been in for questioning the whole day, and he was starting to catch on that he's like, do you guys think I'm a suspect? Like, I just had a dream. Like, I was just trying to help. They were like, no, but can we get some DNA testing? Can we do that? They were like on it. So finally, Steven's picking up on the fact that he's really being interrogated. They won't let him leave. They want DNA samples. And he's like, yes. They took his car and impounded it. Get DNA samples. Do whatever. I have no connection to this. Have whatever you want, because holy crap, I was just calling you because I had a dream and I was trying to help. They keep a close eye on him, and on November 24th, 1980, Steven was driving home. He was pulled over and placed under arrest for Karen's murder. Now, the DNA at the time didn't confirm or deny Steven, and I'm going to explain this. Basically, one, DNA testing wasn't advanced enough, but two, a non-secretor is a person who doesn't pass their blood type antigens into bodily fluids. And at the time, they weren't able to break down DNA the same way they are now. So they weren't able to match the DNA because of there wasn't blood, right, from the other person. However, Steven was also a non-secretor, and only about 20% of the population is. So it didn't rule him out, but it wasn't for sure him.
Case, you're a non-secretor, right?
Hey,
Don't talk to me like that.
So on June 16th, 1982, he was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 40 years in prison.
All right, sounds right.
3 years later, the case was reversed because he truly was never proven guilty. He was just likely to be guilty. And you can't put somebody in prison because you're like, hey, doesn't it kind of look like he did it because he was talking about it? You can't do that,
Brian.
okay?
I don't know. He looked like he did it. So if I was on the jury, guilty.
Okay, but right, and that's what happened. So he was released from prison. However, the reversal was reversed, okay?
Oh.
Because they were like, no, we think you did it. Then it was reversed back to freedom because, like, wait, there's no proof. And when they were going through these trials, this took 7 more years. So he served 3 years, and this took 7 more years. The reverse, okay?
Sounds like a Tony Hawk move.
It's insane. So this is what they found out, and this is genuinely awful, and it makes my heart break for Steven. Something that was left out of trial intentionally. The hair that was found on Karen's dead body belonged to a black man, and obviously Steven was not that. So they knew at trial the hair on Karen is totally not this guy's. On top of that, now that we're 10 years down the road total, the DNA had advanced and the DNA and Steven's were too different. It did not match. So he was 100% innocent, and he spent 3 years in prison and 7 more years on probation fighting for his freedom just because he literally called about a dream.
Kenzie's Crimes.
Milwaukee police found body parts in a North Side apartment.
Not because I was angry with them, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me.
Believe me, if I started murdering people, there'd be none of you left.
This is evil, what those people have done to me.
See, says Heaven's Gate away team.
I'm not guilty. Q101.
Wow, remember, if you missed any part of that, it'll be on the podcast, the Brian and Kenzie podcast, the full Kenzie's Crimes. If you came in at the end and want to hear the beginning of the story, it's all laid out for you there by Kenzie.
Brian and Kenzie in the morning. And Chicago's alternative all day.
Q101.